And welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's APMG webinar in partnership with the Service Automation Framework. My name's Estelle Hicks-Bennett and I'll be your host and moderator today. I'm delighted to be joined by presenter Jan-Willem Middelberg, founder of SAF and author of several books, including the Service Automation Framework itself. I'm looking forward to the explanation of the often confused processes of Service Automation and Robotic Process Automation, or RPA. Jan-Willem is a pioneer and advocate for professionalisation in both automation and big data, and when not in lockdown can frequently be found delivering keynote speeches or moderating at universities and technology conferences around the world. So before his presentation, I'm just going to touch on a little bit of housekeeping here. The recording will be sent to you if you registered via email afterwards, and will be able to be found on the APMG website along with the slides. Please do engage, chat and comment and ask questions throughout. As a question pops up, if you pop it in the question panel, and then Jan-Willem will get to that at the end. And any feedback you have, we welcome. So whether it's positive, constructive, whatever you want to say, it helps us to make sure that we give you the content that you want. So it's great to have you with us today, Jan-Willem. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. It's a great pleasure, and thanks so much for inviting me to talk about topic that I think is very fascinating in today's day and age, and that is what is service automation and robotic process automation, and where are the differences and similarities between the two. Before we get started today, I'm very interested to learn a little bit about the people who are on the call, so I would really love it if you would take a moment to let us know from which country you're dialing in and which industry you're in, and if you can do that in the chat, we can kind of summarize where everybody's from. And this also can help you test the functionalities of the chat. All the participants are in listen-only mode at the moment, and we will open up for questions towards the end of this webinar. So here we will ensure that we can run through the Q&A and answer any pressing questions you might have about any of the materials that we're going to be presenting today. So that's a bit of housekeeping from my side. Let's get started because there's a lot of things that we're going to be talking about today. What is the agenda? So the topics today is obviously going to be on automation, and we will specifically look at two terms that are very frequently used within the automation space, and that is service automation and robotic process automation. And what I found in my work over the last recent years is that there's sometimes a bit of confusion between the two. So that is one of the reasons that we thought it would be really good to do a webinar today to kind of clear up the differences between those two concepts, and also dive into a little bit further on, well, if we understand the differences between those two types of automation, is there any way that they can be integrated or can be combined? And as you guessed it, that's something that we will talk about in the second half of this webinar. I've also used the opportunity to kind of include a case study because that kind of explains it always a little bit better. So I will show you some examples of how service automation can be used together with RPA, and how you can bridge or build a bridge between those two different concepts. And as Estelle mentioned, we're going to be answering questions at the end. So if you have any questions during the course or during the webinar, already put them into the chat box, and Estelle will moderate all of them in terms of importance and people that would like to have the answers to them. Good, let's give a bit of background to the automation movement that we see growing, especially in the last 4 to 5 years. Automation is really a driving force of what is commonly referred to as the Industry 4.0, which is a kind of a revolution that we're in which we are ensuring that we automate through the use of software programs more and more processes within companies themselves. And if you've ever used any digital app in which you've never talked to anybody on the other side of the phone, you are likely to have already engaged in automated processes by yourself. This Industry 4.0 movement comes out of a large number of steps leading up to it. It's all started with the 18th century and the invention of the time machine. Then we moved more towards process automation and the construction of cars, and that's the era of Henry Ford and the conveyor belts. And then the Industrial Revolution 3.0 kind of happened between the 70s and 90s, where additional automation and robots were introduced, especially more for the production side of things. So I think that's the biggest change between version number 3 and Industry 4.0, in which we are today, is whereas Industry 3.0 focused a lot about production, what we see now is that there's way more emphasis on service. And that's kind of builds a bridge to the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is the service automation versus robotic process automation, which is, I think, best known as the term RPA. And let me start with asking you a question. Do you think they're friends or foes? And that's something we will discuss in the next 30 minutes is, do they work together or are they kind of different approaches? So service automation, as you might have already experienced, is totally focused towards the services, whereas robotic process automation is way more focused towards the processes themselves. So we will review first the difference between the two different concepts, and then we will kind of summarize on how you can integrate and work with them together. So let's get started on that. This is a slide I typically like to use in order to explain what is the concept of service automation, because that's the first thing that we're going to be looking at that. In recent years, you have seen a number of enormous companies coming up, companies that were not present or not at the size they are today, and they grew to such great heights in only or in less than a decade. Companies like Uber, Grab, Booking, Netflix, and Spotify. And if you take a bit of a closer look at the business model of these companies, there's two important things that you can notice there. The first key element to importance is to realize that they are all service providers. They don't sell any goods, they don't sell any physical products, but they provide services to their users. So in that sense, they are true service providers. The other key thing that all of these companies have in common is that they provide services in a completely automated fashion, meaning that from the moment that you sign up for their service to the way that you receive it, deliver it, invoicing, payments, even reviews, etc., everything happens automatically. And one of the key questions I always like to ask to people is if you've ever used a service like this. You might have gone somewhere recently with a Uber, or you might have put on a Netflix series, especially if you're at home these days. Have you ever spoken to anybody who actually works at any of these organizations? There's a very good chance that you haven't. And the reason for that is that the delivery model of these companies is completely automated. So they provide you with an interface, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in the next few minutes, but they provide you with an interface through which you can use a service end-to-end. And with end-to-end, I mean not just the initial sign up or creating an account or something, but every supporting process along the way is delivered through that same interface. And this is what really makes those companies unique, is that they are all basing their delivery models on a service automation model. So if we analyze that in more detail, we could come up with a definition of service automation. And although this definition sometimes sounds very simple, for a lot of companies, it really requires a different way of thinking, and more importantly, a different mindset. So if we look at service automation, it is obviously the automated delivery of a service. And with automated, we mean we need to have scripts and workflows in place that ensure that that service can be delivered, even if it's in the middle of the night or very after hours. They always need to work. So whenever the customer requests the service, the automated service needs to be delivered. And that immediately brings us to the second point. If you want to move towards a model of service automation and automated delivery of services, you need to realize that automated services only happen based on the autonomous requests of users. So what we really mean with that is that the user is in charge. the Grab service would not be used, or the Uber service would not be used if people never requested. So every process is initiated by a user. And again, although this sounds very simple, for a lot of companies, this really is requires a bit of a shift in thinking, because it automatically means that the user needs to be placed centrally. The third core component, it's automation, obviously. So we will need to have some kind of a technology platform in order to deliver those services. And in most frequent cases, this is something known as a self-service portal. Could be a mobile app, could be a website, but there's always some kind of self-service technology platform that is required in order to deliver those services to the end users. And if we do that in a good way, we design the processes such that we provide that optimal user experience. And that is really necessary to realize, because if you're choosing for an automated delivery model, it means there is no communication between the service provider on the one hand and the user at the other. So you really need to make sure that the service experience is really good, because otherwise people might leave your platform or stop using your services. So that's a very important aspect of what service automation is about. And one of the benefits that some of the companies that we mentioned previously drive upon is that within service automation, and if you think about that more closely, it really doesn't matter whether you provide services to 10 or 100 or 10,000 people, because service automation by definition facilitates a very scalable business model. And this is something companies really like, and I think it's also one of the key reasons why those exponential companies that we talked about earlier have been able to grow so rapidly. A second key business driver for automation, service automation, is that it kind of guides all of the information through the self-service portal. So as an organization, you will know exactly how much time people spend in particular sections of your service, which sections are popular, which ones aren't, and you can start to make really data-driven improvement decisions based upon the previous messages. So that's a very important aspect to realize. Additionally, if you're delivering automated services, you need to place your user central, which is the point that we made on the previous slide. And that is with the objective to provide this unique and good user experience all of the time. And by doing that, you kind of retain customers, because if people like to use your service, there's not a very high chance that they will switch over to another provider. The fourth, and I always refer to this as the CFO argument, there is of course a very strong business case for automating your services, because in most cases it provides a more cost-efficient solution, especially if you consider things like out-of-hours support or things that need to happen during the middle of the night. It's way cheaper to let an automated script run in the middle of the night than to have a whole team that is up and running to provide support. So these are some of the key business drivers, and also I would say the reason that service automation has grown so rapidly in recent years. So how do we do that? Because realizing that you need to automate and that you need to move towards an automated delivery model sounds very simple, but in practice it takes a lot of effort to make that happen. So the way that we do this, and this is what you see in front of you on the slide, is the service automation framework model, is that we provide step-by-step model and approach to make sure that you can move from analog services, which are still provided by people, all the way towards automated services. So the webinar today is way too short to cover all of the aspects of the service automation framework, but we've done a previous one with APMG last year. So if you're interested in that, there's a recording up on YouTube where you can really dive into the different aspects of the service automation framework. I've also written a white paper on this, so you can download that at the end of the webinar. I will showcase to you where you can download this kind of information. Using the service automation framework, which we see again depicted here at the bottom of the slides, we basically do a very simple step. We use all of the technologies and the techniques that are in there in order to move from a service delivery model, which we see on the left, which I typically refer to as the traditional service provider, towards the model that you see on the right. So A service is almost in all cases constituted by a number of interactions between a service provider on the one hand side and a user on the other side. And the service, if you're going to a training or you're using a banking service, is nothing more, but also nothing less than a number of interactions between that service provider and the user. And the step that we're making when we're applying the service automation framework is to place this additional layer in between, so that we facilitate a model in which all of the users start to interact with a self-service portal. And it's then up to the service provider that you still see on top to make sure that the processes in the back end of that service provider work in an automated fashion. And that's really what we refer to when we talk about automated processes. It is ensuring that people can help themselves on any kind of interface or technology portal. And this is going to be a short bridge to the case study I'm going to be presenting later. So what are kinds of organizations that can benefit a lot from service automation? Well, think for instance about government or local government. In any country in the world, in any region, there is always a strong responsibility of governments to make sure that it takes care of their citizens. So any government basically has two main jobs. First of all, it needs to be a representation of the people that it represents. So in most cases that it's citizens. That's the reason that you have elections. That's the reason that there's representation across the world from people that have been elected. That's one part of government, but there's also a very important other aspect of government, and that is to provide administrative purposes for supplying goods and services to everybody that is under their constituency. Think, for instance, if the moment that you would like to get a driver's license, from the getting a building permit to asking for a new parking license, to getting a marriage certificate, to getting a passport, you name it. All of these are services that governments need to provide to their people. In a very similar way, it works in any other organization. So whether you're using HR services, IT services, legal services, or even things like maintenance and repairs, all of these services are used by users in any type of organization. But I've picked the example today for government because we're going to showcase a little bit later on how service automation and RPA kind of fit together in order to make this work. So if we look at government as a service provider, it's really, really simple. We look at it from a single point of contact. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you see all the different services that a government could provide. And the way that we want to make sure that we want to deliver them, if we choose an automated delivery model, is to build a single point of contact for citizens so that they can request their services at a central location. And you see now that a lot of governments are doing this. You used to go to different buildings across cities to wait in line, get a ticket, go there to get a new parking permit, or go there to get a new building license. All of that was decentralized. So what a lot of governments are now doing is that they start to implement that from a service automation kind of perspective. So what they are doing is that they're building these citizen portals that really form this single point of contact, and people can request all of their services at this particular location. So here's an example from my hometown, which is the city of Amsterdam. Here on this particular website, you could see that this is the first page that you enter when you search for the city of Amsterdam. And here you see the role that the government provides in providing all of these services. So things like parking, waste and recycling, for registration for jobs, immigration, registration, all of the typical things that any local government would provide are now done through an automated self-service portal. This is really the concept of service automation. So this is what I wanted to start this webinar with, is get you familiar with what is the key purpose and what do we mean when we talk about service automation, because this is really crucial. It's really about the end-to-end delivery of a complete service from the early beginning all the way until the service has been completed. Because that is slightly different from how robotic process or automation works. So we've just discussed what is the definition and key concepts behind service automation. I'm now going to make a bit of the transition towards the world of RPA, because robotic process automation is also a movement that's hugely popular, has been growing very, very rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years. And this is really more of a software-based solution. So if we look at the definition of the IEE Standards Association, it says that robotic process automation is pre-configured software instance that uses business rules and predefined activity to complete autonomous execution of a combination of processes, activities, transactions, and tasks in one or more unrelated services. So it's a pretty long definition, but basically what we aim to do with robotic process automation is to look in depth at a business process within a particular company or organization, and then take the steps to fully automate that process. So it could be something as simple as or booking in invoices into a system, or for instance, onboarding a new employee and getting all of the details into a particular contract. Those are very common and standardized examples of how RPA works. So where has RPA grown really rapidly in the last couple of years? Well, that is particularly in the establishment of what we now refer to as high-performing back offices, because executing tasks that are primarily suitable to be done by robots are processes that are very repetitive and nobody likes to do in an organization anyway. And if you use automation and robots, when I refer to robots, we actually mean a particular script that runs or a particular workflow that's being executed. We can see that this is particularly useful in order to improve the performance of back office processes, because most back offices have very centralized processes, are standardized, they need to be optimized and technology enabled. So this is really how we can work with RPA in order to improve the performance. And the question you might then ask yourself is, well, what is then a good process to automate? And the analogy I always give is you should look at RPA processes as swivel chair processes. And those are processes that are repetitive, process-oriented, high volume, and low risk. And if you build in automation there, that is really where the value of automation comes in. So think about putting forms into particular systems, data entry tasks, approving expense reports at the end of the month, all the things that happen every single month that nobody actually likes to do, that's prime to be optimized by RPA solutions. So I hope that this gives you a bit of a feeling of what RPA is all about. So swivel chair processes, if we dive into that a little bit further, are present in every organization, and it doesn't really matter how big or small your company is and which particular industry you are in, whether it's healthcare or government or oil and gas, all big companies have back office processes. And even if you're a small company, you're going to have back office processes as well. So what we want to do when we want to automate these kinds of processes is look at what is the data that is required in those individual process steps. We would like to then define that process from an automation point of view. So what are the exact steps that we're going through? And then we would like to either update a particular system or make sure that it's, the particular task is resolved automatically. So that's basically the 3 steps that we will go through in terms of automating processes. So that is something that already has shown to be very, very effective. If we look at a recent study that was published by McKinsey, is that there's some really strong results in terms of applying RPA in an organization on a day-to-day basis. This particular study reports up to 25% in cost savings, and maybe even more importantly, 62% reduction in errors. And this is also, I think, one of the key things that is really frequently overlooked in companies, is that if people do mistake or do work, they tend to make mistakes if they need to do the same thing over and over again. Because if you need to do the same thing over and over again, you can get some kind of a fatigue that makes sure that you start to make errors. And that's the beauty of robots. As soon as you write the script once and you write it well, a robot doesn't make any mistakes because it just executes the same steps over and over again. So the same study from McKinsey also shows that in the projects that they've looked at, there was over 200% return on investment. So yes, it does take a bit of time and money to start automating your processes, but if you do that consistently, you will see these kinds of return figures, which really make the business case for automation, I would say, very easy and also very sound. In the previous segment, I've showcased a little bit on, well, what are the activities that we do within service automation. If we look at RPA kinds of solutions, I'm not going to go into specific technologies today here, but basically how it works is that RPA technologies are relatively easy configurable because they act as a layer upon your existing infrastructure, meaning that you don't necessarily need to change your whole IT landscape, but you can just build particular workflows upon your own software systems. And that is also how RPA really differs from other things like business process automation or business process outsourcing, is that frequently happens within the organization, whereas RPA is frequently a layer that's been put on top of the existing IT infrastructure. So that makes it relatively easy to configure, and with all kinds of good technology that's available today, building an automated process is as simply as dragging and dropping certain components that you do on a day-to-day basis, and then you start building your workflow based on some very simple business rules. So you can even build some very simple automations like getting data from one particular form and putting it into an Excel sheet or putting it into a contract. Those are the easiest forms of automation. And they are very, very effective, because think about the number of times that or the amount of hours that you've probably spent in your career copy pasting information between documents. All of those kinds of things can be automated using these very simple workflows that are present in RPA software systems. So if I recap a little bit, I know it's a lot of information, but if we recap especially on the difference between service automation and RPA, we see that the focus of service automation is particularly on end-to-end service automation. So as I mentioned before, all the way from signing up with a particular provider, all the way to the invoicing, processing, and the whole service experience. Whereas if we look at RPA specifically, we look at a focus of the automation of one particular process or a number of particular processes. But that also means that RPA always focuses at automation from an organizational point of view. So from the back office or the service provider point of view. Whereas if we look at service automation, it is really a design approach that considers the whole value chain and focuses way more on towards the actual user, so the person that needs to consume the service. And that is, I think, where we have the biggest differences between service automation framework and RPA, is that level of focus and that level of scope is completely different. One last word about, well, how does business process management fit within all of that? Well, that I would say it's very similar to RPA, but the focus there is mainly within the existing infrastructure and the existing applications. So in that sense, it's a category which is also very related, but also different from the two that we discuss, particularly in this webinar today. So I hope that makes a bit of sense. This is the more theoretical approach to look at the differences between the two different methodologies. What I will do next is explain it with a bit more of a practical example. And I think then if we do it that way, things start to fall in place a little bit more. Because this is the picture that you've seen in one of the previous slides, where I asked the question at the beginning of this webinar, are service automation and robotic process automation, are they friends or foes? Well, the definite answer to that question is they're definitely going to be friends, because you can use RPA in order to enable service automation. And service automation needs RPA in order to execute the workflows and scripts in the backend. So it's definitely a collaboration, and I've seen a lot of organizations where this works really, really well, where you have this front-facing portal or self-service solution that is subsequently supported by RPA processes. So let's have a look at how that works. And the example I'm going to give you again is the same example that we discussed previously. Let's look at a government portal. The example I gave from the city of Amsterdam. How can a government body that wants to provide its services through a self-service portal towards all of their citizens, how can they automate the back-end processes that are required to make sure that those automations happen? So the way that we want to do it, if you take the analogy that I've given before, the situation you see on the left is coming out of service automation. The figure that you see at the right is coming out of the section that we just discussed about RPA. So the main question, of course, is, well, how can we kind of integrate these two? How can we still make sure that we have this customer-facing, user-oriented portal, and where users can literally get A to Z service and go through the whole value chain of activities that they would like to complete. Whereas at the back end, we have all the smart technologies and the smart processes available so that the workflows get executed consistently and in a way that is smart and doesn't require any human intervention. So that's the question that we're trying to solve here. And the way that I would like to illustrate this is by one particular aspect of a service that is provided by every government, and that is the request of a new passport. If you look at the slide here in front of you, you see that this is a technique that comes out of the service automation theory, and it's the concept of making blueprints, and we refer to this technique as service automation blueprinting. So again, we don't go into the whole technique of blueprinting today, but in a very high level, all the user steps are happening at the top of the slide, whereas all of the service provider processes happen at the bottom of the slide. So very typically, if you consider a workflow is, and you would like to get a new passport, you first file a request for a new passport. So you go to some kind of government portal that's going to make a log of that you either lost your passport or that you would like to request a new one. What subsequently happens at the back end is that there needs to be some kind of a check that validates whether the person that is asking for a new passport is actually the person that there is a record of. So that means that the first thing that we need to do is that we need to do some kind of a process. And we refer to this process in this particular example as the identity validation and confirmation process. So that is a process that can be automated. And this is exactly what we're going to see the integration between the two. In very similar steps, we see that there's a number of different aspects that compose the whole end-to-end service of from the initial moment that you request your passport until you have received a notification that you can collect your passport, and you can collect it in person or maybe by some kind of mailing system, depends on which country you're in. But the key point I want to make here is that this is an example of service automation. It showcases how a service is provided all the way from the initial request from the user point of view, all the way to the final delivery of the service. So this is really the steps that we will go through. However, if we build a blueprint like this, we can see that we need to have a number of processes. And those processes have been outlined in what we refer to as the fourth layer, which are the supporting processes. So if we look at the three supporting processes that would be required in this particular example, it would be the identity validation and confirmation process, the production process, and the release process. And these are just kind of container terms to make sure that everything fits on the slide. You can devise many more processes along the way. But for illustration purposes, I think this works really well because this is exactly where RPA comes in. If you have the technology and the portal available to support your users, you can subsequently start using RPA techniques in order to fully automate these processes. So here you see the 3 boxes that I've circled in red. This is how RPA applies within the context of service automation. So I kind of hope that that makes a bit of sense. So if we look at the scoping, and I think this picture kind of explains it best, if we look at the domain of service automation, we see that it's basically still the whole end-to-end service delivery, all the way from the initial onboarding of customers and users, all the way towards their overall experience and all the steps that are in between them. However, if we look at the domain of RPA specifically, we look at the bottom part of the slide. So this is the service provider activities that need to take place. So at the service provider, we need to have a number of automated processes that need to be provided through that technology interface. So we need to collect the data, and we also need to have people who are involved with those automations, and they typically work at the service provider themselves. So the bottom 3 layers, which represent the service organization, can be perfectly managed and optimized by RPA solutions. So I always kind of showcase this illustration because it clarifies so greatly what is the difference in scope of what service automation does compared to what RPA does in effect every single day. So I hope that that kind of explains a little bit on what is the similarities and differences of RPA. So if we can kind of summarize what we've done in the last 35 minutes, is that we first looked at what service automation is, and we discussed that service automation is predominantly used for the design and delivery of an automated service through self-service technology. So that interface and the fact that the user is in charge is very important to understand the design of automated services, and service automation is a method to accomplish that. We subsequently talked about the concept of RPA. So we looked at this as a form of business process automation, and that looks very specifically at automating individual processes. And we use software, which is basically robots, for the automated execution of those processes. So after we discussed the concept of service automation and the concept of RPA, we started to integrate the two. So the good news, and this is also from my experience that I've seen a lot of organizations do very well, is service automation, RPA can be fully integrated. So service automation provides you with the design of the customer journey from a user point of view, and it will ensure that you set up that self-service portal through which all interaction happens with the users. And then subsequently, you can use RPA techniques and technology to automate the required processes necessary at the back end of the service provider. So if you really want to make a separation, is that service automation is more oriented towards the front end of the whole customer journey, whereas RPA powers the back end processes of the same service provider. And the way where you can bring those two together, as we've seen in the example, is through use of a service automation blueprint. So if you start visualizing and start drawing the whole customer experience journey from beginning to end, you can really use the blueprint in order to identify, well, if I want to generate this particular user experience, what kind of technology and what kind of processes would I need to have in order to facilitate that? And those particular processes can be automated through RPA. So I hope that this provides some additional clarification and makes you understand once and for all where is the integration and the intersection between service automation and RPA. So as some last final remarks, although these two are completely different domains in the sense of that they have a different focus area, I think that the true value is in combining it. And if Aristotle already said a very, very long time ago that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So I really think that that's a very good analogy. If you combine SAF and RPA together, you get a result that is better than the sum of its parts. So I think that's a really good way to round up this particular knowledge session about the difference between service automation and RPA. I think now would be a very good moment to ask Estelle to come back into the call. I've seen my chat go crazy while I was presenting. So I think there's a lot of questions that came in. So Estelle, would you be kind to moderate some of the questions that have been coming in, and then we can do a bit of Q&A.
Indeed. Thank you very much, jan-willem, and thanks so much for a superb presentation. Once again, in jan-willem style, how you pack so much information into such a short time, I have no idea, but you've done it again. That's absolutely brilliant, and I think I'm certainly clear on the difference now, and I wasn't before. So I think you've achieved your goal there. That's amazing. Thank you. So question number 1 from Gurpreet is which corporate or business models work in synergy with the service automation framework, particularly for local government?
Can you repeat the beginning of the question? So which
corporate or business models work in synergy with the service automation framework, particularly in local government?
Yeah. So a lot of basically, it doesn't really matter which business model you can think of. The most important element is that that particular government body provides a service towards individuals or companies. So you can think about the whole spectrum of government services, from simple things like civil services, but also permits. I've recently worked on a very interesting project which needed to be built within a couple of weeks, which were letters of approval for the whole containment of the virus, so that people could go out and request authorization letters that needed to be automatically produced. So the scope is not really limited, or the business model is not really limited, I would say. It's more about the fact that the government body needs to have a role of a service provider, and they need to execute repetitive processes that provide value, but which are done over and over again. And a lot of the things that any government does is really repetitive. Think about the hundreds of thousands of permits they execute every year, building licenses, renewals of companies, waste management. All of those things are within the scope of service automation.
That's great. Thank you, jan-willem. And something I think that may be a little related to that, and apologies if I'm wrong, but someone's saying if you're looking for an RPA vendor, what are some of the things that you need to look out for?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I deliberately did not go into this presentation to discuss number of vendors because we want to keep this presentation and the methodologies vendor neutral. But obviously there are a lot of RPA commercial solutions out there. What I think what is very important is to focus specifically on the integrations with the systems that you currently have. As I mentioned before, RPA kind of differentiates from BPM, for instance, by the fact that you're building this additional layer, meaning you don't need to change your underlying IT systems and your databases, etc. However, if you realize that, then it's very important that the system and the tool that you choose has that integration with your IT systems, and that you don't need to build that completely from scratch. So my recommendation always for companies that are looking at specific technology is first look at your own technology stack, determine where the processes are going through and which kind of data is required, and based upon those requirements, select your vendor and look at the different tools and technologies. A lot of the RPA vendor community is obviously very good in making all kinds of good presentations and ensuring that there's a lot of features that are presented in their marketing campaigns, but really the more technical integrations is really what will make your RPA solution successful or not.
Thank you, jan-willem. Okay, from LK, the Association of Project Management, APM, in the UK in 2017 said that robotics was an area that their project management profession needs to grasp. Any comments on this? Should service automation and robotics be something a PMO coordinate?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think that this is a very interesting question, also a very interesting comment that project managers should get actively involved in automation. My short answer to that question would definitely be yes. What we see happening a lot is that, first of all, implementations of these kinds of RPA or automation projects is frequently done in a project management style. But automation is also, I think, something which is here to stay. So if you want to be an effective project manager, you need to understand how those workflows and scripts can enhance any kind of project that you're doing. In most cases, project management organizations and especially PMO officers are also characterized by the fact that they do a lot of repetitive work. Think about the daily reports or budget tracking and those kinds of activities. So whereas RPA and automation can really help on the success of the project itself, I think they can also greatly enhance the PMO office in itself as well, because if you automate those back-end processes, you basically make it a double win in that particular scenario. So yeah, I think it's a really good comment, a very interesting one as well.
Thank you, Jan-Willem. And the last one for now, unless anything pops up whilst you're talking, I'm assuming this may well be coming from a training company, because of course we've got people that want to learn it and others that are looking for training as well. But they're saying with the service automation framework, who would be your usual attendees or candidates, I guess? Are they from the business side or the technical side?
Well, my experience is that it's primarily business driven, and that is mainly because one of the earlier slides that I presented about those business drivers. So if you well, let's consider the example that has been happening around the world in recent weeks. Is a lot of more traditional service providers were confronted with the fact that they couldn't go out and meet their clients anymore due to government regulations or whatever part of the world you are, the severity of what's going on in the world. So in order to still operate and in order to still provide business, a lot of those companies started to quickly look at how can we still deliver service, but now in an automated fashion, so that we don't need to meet our customers in a face-to-face kind of situation. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is that it doesn't really matter which kind of service you provide. It is, as long as you do it in an automated fashion, you will be able to get those benefits that we discussed. So things like more cost efficiency, but also better user experience and scalability. So because of that, I think it's mainly business driven. And this is also what I've seen in the training courses as well, is that it's primarily companies that currently deliver manual service, or they have a service model that they would like to upgrade towards automated service delivery. So I think that's the most important target audience.
Okay, and we've got one sneaking through like Indiana Jones just under the door just before we close it from John, who's saying, what are the key risks in implementing an RPA solution?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's a very famous quote, and it might be good to end with that as well. There's a very famous quote from Bill Gates that said, if you automate a bad process, then you're gonna create more work than you originally envisioned. Whereas if you automate a well-designed process, it's going to bring you tremendous business benefits. So the message here is the biggest risk is not having adequate processes in your organization, because if you start to automate those, they will increase the level of bureaucracy and unnecessary work that people need to do. So I think that's a very good quote to end the webinar with today.
Well, that sounds perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you once again, jan-willem. This will be my final word, so I'll turn over to you to close and just finish off with saying thank you so much, everybody, for attending and the amazing engagement today. It's great to hear from you all joining from all over the world.
Thank you so much, Estelle. From my side, it has really been a pleasure to host this webinar. I hope it's been informative for everyone. I also have a small request as closing out. We're at the moment looking to expand our ambassador network. So we've recently launched our ambassador program, which you can find on the Service Automation website. So if you would be interested in working more closely with the Service Automation Alliance and being the first for new kinds of programs that are coming up or represent a particular region, I really would appreciate it if you would consider becoming an ambassador. I've had tremendous fun preparing and doing this webinar. Once again, thanks so much, Estelle and APMG, for hosting me today. And I really look forward to seeing you back in any of our next upcoming sessions.